Hi, everyone. It's definitely been a minute since my last podcast episode. And I just want to say, sometimes life happens. And yeah, that's kind of what happened this year. But I'm back now. There's lots of things to still digest about everything that I've been going through. There's lots of stuff to share. And I think this episode that I've recorded with Lori Latimer, months ago, actually, um, is the perfect thing to be sharing right now because it's something that I've been going through this year, which is the grief that comes from separating and, going through divorce with someone that was a huge part of my life. So grief comes in many forms. And oftentimes we think that grief is, the loss of someone when someone close to us dies. And of course, that's a really potent form of grief, but grief also comes in many, many forms. And you'll hear me and Lori talk in this episode about, her work as a divorce lawyer and also her own personal journey of losing a son and how these two, obviously they are not the same thing, but the process that it takes you through, the grief that as a result of these journeys is similar in a lot of ways. And so, you know, if you've ever had those periods in your life that have required you to be so damn present that it's hard to show up, anywhere else, where all creative energy and desire to show up in any moment other than the embodied presence seems completely drained from your core. It seems like it might never come back. Like that's kind of where I've been, for a large portion of this year. And I finally feel myself sort of starting to emerge from this cocoon a little bit and starting to emerge as a completely, new version of self. And interestingly enough, I am a Scorpio rising in the final degree of Scorpio, and I've got and my Venus and my Pluto in Scorpio as well. And this life has been a constant lesson, of death and rebirth, and the fact that we have to go through death to create new life. And I really want to invite this lens for you as you listen to this podcast episode that I think is going to be so impactful for you if you're anyone that has had to grieve the end of a relationship, had to grieve the loss of someone, had to grieve a job, had to, move their life somewhere completely new. That's grief as well. Had to grieve things that maybe you didn't get, in your life that you should have gotten, right? Love, support, um, emotional support, whatever it might be. I just hope that you remember that grief breeds creativity as well. And even though it doesn't seem like they go hand in hand, grief is that death. It's that Scorpio energy that needs to happen to clear space for life, which is the Taurus energy. And this is that constant cyclical nature as well of that feminine energy. And so, for myself personally, um, I've had a real creative block because I've been going through so much this year. This all kind of started really early this year for me. And it was a lot of processing, a lot of making big decisions, a lot of, considerations for how other people are going to be impacted by me talking about this openly in my, in my business, on my platform. And with all of that, there's been this big creative block. And I'm still, struggling with that some days. I feel myself, like I said, sort of coming back to life a little bit, but it's interesting because I'm in the midst of all this. Of course, most of you probably know that I also bought a van and I'm now living in my van, which I will give you a tour at some point. I feel like there's some finishing touches I still want to figure out. And I've moved out to British Columbia. I'm currently, I recently attended a class at this yoga studio aptly named Alchemy Flow. And I had this really like nice, unique sort of return to my body, return to my practice because I've been on the road and there's been so much like uprooting. And it was really interesting because the teacher shared something around creativity. And I can't remember the exact words, but it had something to do with the, there was an important reminder there around creative energy not being finite, right? Not being consistent. Um, that creative energy is feminine in nature. It waxes and wanes, just like the moon through her phases. It's cyclical, right? And cycles remind us that energy is never created or destroyed. It's only transformed, it's only alchemized. And as quoted on this yoga studio wall, they had a definition of the word alchemy. And it said, alchemy is a seemingly magical process of transformation, creation, or combination. How fitting. I recently changed my title to astrologer and alchemist. And therefore, it's no surprise that I found this cute studio, and that it's really a reflection of the journey I was put on this earth to embody as this scorpionic soul, one of constant death and rebirth. And I have to say, this year has been the biggest death of my life. I feel like I've become a walking prototype of alchemy, the seemingly magical transformation of one form to another. And the alchemy portal I've been in this year is just like unlike anything I've experienced in my life so far. And I'm someone who has, like as a child, my family uprooted and moved across the world. And I have, changed a lot of jobs. I've changed a lot of like places that I've lived in. Like I've have done a lot of death and rebirth, but nothing compared to this year. And it was, yeah, very dark. I've felt like sort of Alice falling down this deep, dark rabbit hole, with no light in sight. This fall was marked with various stages of grief, through loss of identity, through loss of relationships. I was even met with a mirror so potent recently that led me through yet another dark night of the soul. After having already gone through all of this, right? After having gone through this separation, gone through like leaving all of my friends, leaving my community, leaving my family, moving into a van, driving across the country. There was this big mirror held up um, to me around my own sort of relating patterns. And it's no surprise really because Pluto is making a difficult aspect to my natal Venus from now until, for a few years, basically. And I'm currently on my Venus line astrocartography too. And so Pluto is the alchemist. It's this energy of irreversible processes of death and rebirth. And so, it's not really surprising that this is a time when I chose to, in some ways, really start from scratch, rebuild, right? Like I'm starting from scratch in so many ways, in so many different aspects of like who I'm in relationship with, right? Like whether they are platonic, romantic, whatever, like there's relationships in general, there's a complete restructuring happening here. And when Pluto is active in your life, this is this irreversible energy. It's the energy of the birth canal, right? Like once the baby's being born, like there's no going back. There's no going back in. And when Pluto's active in your life, you can either sort of stay small and afraid of your own power, or you can bravely walk into the dark, scary underworld of your shadow. And while it's been squaring my natal Venus, all of my own patterns, core beliefs and conditioning around self-worth have been exposed and are being exposed so that I can choose whether to let the subconscious rule my life or stand in my power and face them. So with the help of Pluto, I've really been unearthing this energy of Venus in my own chart and in her current cycle in the sky. And honestly, the revelations have been profound. Not only does Venus's cycle perfectly align with the core events in my life that led to the dissolution of my marriage, but June's Venus Cazimi brought major mirrors that led me into some of the deepest self-worth wounding from my teenage years. As someone who's really scorpionic at their core, my intensity and depth has always I felt like intimidated some people sometimes. And this was particularly evident for me as I was coming into my sexuality as a teenager. And we all know, sex, power, and creativity are one and the same, right? And so, as someone who's always had to kind of prove their worthiness based on productivity and performance in school growing up, of course, my pattern would be chasing partners who enforce this same pattern. And it really fueled my addiction to what's familiar, proving my worth and my power using my sexual energy, and only to sort of scare these poor immature souls who um, found me maybe too intense, my perceptive nature too intense. And so there's this old programming that's been, coming up around you're too much, but simultaneously, like something must be wrong with you, right? And so right now I'm being faced with situations that challenge me to reshape these subconscious beliefs that tell me that this is my problem. And must be something wrong with me, right? That I'm too much or that I'm somehow not enough. And, isn't this the tale as old as time that a woman in a world that is being used to women being submissive and subordinate, there must be something wrong with the idea of a woman having power. And I think this is a really interesting topic to bring up right now around Virgo season as well, because Virgo is really connected, and being a Virgo sun myself, and I have my Mars in Virgo too, which Mars is like your sexual energy in a lot of ways. Virgo is all about like owning yourself, right? Having full ownership over yourself. And it is connected to this energy of like sacred sexuality as well. And like knowing that your sexual energy is your creative energy. Sexual energy, power, and creativity are one and the same. And so it's really no surprise that Pluto, which is the symbol of death and rebirth, right? Of the cyclical nature, is needed for all three of these. And that this energy of creativity, of grief, of these cycles is deeply feminine in nature, right? And with this, it means that this energy doesn't have a beginning or end. It can't be created or destroyed, only transformed. So even though there might be times in our lives where we are so deep in the death phase of something, we don't feel like there's no light at the end of the tunnel. We feel like we can't get our creative juices back, right? We have to remember that there will always be creativity, but it comes at the cost of letting something die. They say grief breeds creativity. So here I am painfully aware of the patterns reemerging to be witnessed and transformed, and realizing who I thought I was, what I believed I was worthy of, and what I thought was possible for me. Releasing all of that, right? And I have to say that most days it feels like I'm at war with myself. There's this higher self and truth that I'm very much aware of and believe, but then there's the subconscious and the conditioned self that is not yet fully dead, right? And not yet fully released. And so in some days and in some instances, the higher self is at the wheel, and at others, the subconscious steers. And I would say this is really just the way of life. Like we're always trying our best to choose the light. And at the same time, without the dark, the light would not exist. And so it becomes this eternal dance of yin and yang, dark and light, feminine and masculine. So yeah, if you're finding yourself in a big transition year as well, if you're finding that maybe creativity is not what you thought it was, or you're questioning your creative abilities, or all of this kind of stuff, if you're moving through grief, if you're, yeah, like if you're just having that type of experience right now, or have recently had that experience, or feel that it's coming to you, it's upcoming for you, then this episode that Lori and I get into is going to be really, really potent for you. So that was a little bit of a longer intro than normally, but I just really wanted to give you guys a little bit of an update of what's happening for me in my life, how I'm doing, and I'll try to be more consistent with sharing now that I'm feeling slightly more alive. Okay. Hi, beautiful souls. Welcome back to the Astro Bloom podcast. I'm your host, Vanja Banks, spiritual astrologer and healing guide. And today I have with me Lori Latimer. Lori is a beautiful human being who I've had the pleasure of doing an astrocartography reading for. And I know she just has so much wisdom to share in the world of astrology and a lot about, moving through intense grief and the growth that can also happen through that portal. And I'm so excited to have her here to share all of her wisdom with you guys. Welcome, Lori. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor, and I'm excited to have this conversation.
I'm very excited for you to share your wisdom with my people. So, why don't we start by you letting us know what your big three are in astrology and if you know your human design?
I do. So I'm an Aquarius sun, Libra moon, and Sag rising. And I'm a generator in human design. And I think I'm a 5-1 generator.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I feel like I know a lot of line fives in my life,
Okay.
maybe because I'm a 5 too, so I don't know if that has something to do with it, but yeah, there's a lot of line fives in my life, which is interesting to just
Yeah.
know, right? Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And yeah, I did actually, because I have your chart, so I pulled up your chart just out of curiosity because I love to sometimes piece things together when we're talking. And you do have quite a bit of energy in Capricorn as well, from what I see, and Sag, right? So yeah, there's a lot of you have a very like concentrated chart in a lot of ways. So
Mhm.
yeah, really interesting. Um, so why don't you tell us a little bit more about what it is that you do in the world? How do you help people? What kind of wisdom do you share? I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
So for most of my life, most of my career, I've been a paralegal in family law. And I didn't realize until a few years ago that I was helping people through the process of divorce and custody and all of that. And there's a lot of grief involved in that because a divorce is like the death of a dream, whether you're the one that wants the divorce or not. And so I had this strong foundation in helping people. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology, and so I love helping people. And I started my own business about 10 years ago, 10, 12 years ago, helping women who were overwhelmed and burned out and exhausted. And I didn't really have a focus or a direction with that. And it was just kind of like a little hobby on the side.
Mhm.
And then as with all things in life, I believe, you're led to different things without often understanding why. And so now as a result of my own journey, I really work with women healing from trauma and loss in this life. And I help them understand how they brought the energy of trauma and loss into this life through their past life experiences and through their DNA, through generational past trauma and loss, and help them clear that and understand it. I feel like we have to use both sides of our brain to understand and to really not do the spiritual bypassing that can be prevalent in our work. And so I like to help them understand it from a logical level. So that kind of like satisfies the left side of the brain. So that side of the brain isn't, chattering and questioning and all of that. And also bring in the spiritual piece and the creative piece from the right side of the brain so that it blends together and can really bring women back to a sense of wholeness within themselves.
I love that so much. Thank you for sharing that with us. I think it's so interesting when there's these like little signs of, your soul path, and you might not even really realize it in the beginning, because it's just something that you're kind of led down for whatever reason you end up there. And there comes a time, I think, at least even in my own personal life, I worked in like academics prior to being an astrologer and healer. And I always used to think like, oh, this isn't really for me. Like, why am I here? Like, I feel like I'm not learning anything that's of use. But that profession actually taught me so much about like relationship management, also about taking really complex topics and like distilling them down into concise information for people to be able to easily digest, right? And I use that now in my soul work, in the stuff that I'm actually really lit up by. So it's really interesting how there's these like little nuggets and these little breadcrumbs that tend to feed us these skills that we actually then need in our life and in our soul work, right? So can you speak a little bit to maybe when that realization happened for you as a result of like your own journey? I'd love to learn a little bit more about that.
Sure. So in 2008, I left my marriage, and it was not my first marriage. And I realized I was the common denominator in my marriages and relationships. And I thought, okay, I'm 48 years old. I need to figure out what it is about me that has made the choices I've made. And so I went on what started out as a self-development journey, and that turned into more of a spiritual journey. I started learning about energy healing and Reiki and all these things that, crystals and essential oils and all these things that I had never utilized or worked with. And then in 2014, my mom died very unexpectedly. And then I started studying the afterlife. And I had a couple of readings with mediums that blew my mind because and this was now 2014 isn't that long ago. And yet, technology wise, it's like a whole other lifetime ago. We didn't have Zoom. And I think we had Skype, but this was done over the regular telephone, this reading, the first one I had. And he knew things that were in my home that he could not have known that had belonged to my mom.
Wow.
And so then I started studying the afterlife. And in 2017, again, I don't know why, but something told me to just stop eating sugar. So I cut sugar out of my life, almost completely cold turkey. And I started really working on my wellness and my health and, again, following these breadcrumbs. And then in January of 2019, I got that, as they call it, the call no parent ever wants to get. And my 29-year-old son had passed away very unexpectedly. I had just seen him the day before. And there is nothing in the world that can prepare you for that. I don't care if your child has been sick, has dealt with illness all their life. There is nothing that can prepare you for that. And for it to come out of the blue like it did there aren't words to describe it. And that afternoon, I was standing in my older son's kitchen and I said, there are three things I know. I know that he's okay. I know that I'll see him again when I take my last breath in this life. And I know that this is part of my path. I don't know what it is, but this is part of my path. And what I came to realize was that all the things I had been doing from 2008 until the end of 2018, that 10-year span, had been creating this foundation that I was going to need when this happened, when what I pray to God is the worst tragedy I will ever experience in my life. And because I had that foundation, because I had cleaned up my eating, I was a clear channel for messages to come through from him. And that very first afternoon, I got a message from him. And he came through other people very, very quickly within the first couple of weeks. And I had heard that it takes our souls some time to readjust to spirit when we go back to spirit. Well, not him. And that's typical him. He was larger than life. He had this big personality. He was a Virgo sun. But because I had the faith I had and the spiritual experiences that I had had, if that had happened before 2008, I don't know where I'd be right now. I would probably either be an alcoholic, I would be addicted to prescription pain pills, or I probably wouldn't be here. Because of him, I have continued to live a life that I hope makes him proud and honors his life and legacy. And one of the things that I have said, it's been just over 5 years, and one of the things I have said from the very beginning is, when I take my last breath in this life and I see him again, I want him to say, wow, Mom, look at you. Look what you did after I left and you went through the worst thing of your life. Look what you did to help other people. And so that's why I do what I do, because there are so many. And so let me finish that thought. There are so many women who have lost children, who are stuck, who are in the freeze state. And I understand that, because there are days where it takes everything with that I have inside of me to get up and live my life. Um, but learning tools like astrology and karmic astrology in particular has helped me, again, understand from the left brain point of view, but also bring in the spiritual component so that I have this complete understanding, not just pieces here and there. And astrology was not something I ever saw. I was fascinated by it, but, pop astrology, it's like, whatever. And again, whatever led me to it. And so I started a podcast about a year and a half after he went to Spirit, and I call it Grief with Grace. And I thought I would be speaking to other bereaved mothers. Well, very quickly, I started getting emails from women who not only aren't bereaved mothers, but they don't have children at all. And they had found they were working through their own form of grief. And so I expanded the people I speak to, the people I work
Yeah.
with, to any woman who is healing from trauma and loss, which I believe we all are.
Yeah.
And I'm actually going to be changing the name of the podcast in a couple of months. So more
That's exciting.
reflect what I'm doing. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's something I wouldn't have done before either, because I would have thought, oh, I can only do this one thing. And
Hmm.
being curious is part of what has helped me continue to move forward on my path. And sure, there are some things that I've explored that it's like that's great and I can utilize that in some way, but it's not something I want to teach or work with or dive deeply into. But karmic
Hmm.
astrology and past life work, that's my thing.
Wow, well, thank you so much for your vulnerability and for sharing your journey with everyone here. I am not a mother, so I can't even fathom like that the pain that could have inflicted, and I'm sure it's something that stays with you for the rest of your life. But I think your story is such a powerful example of the transformation that can happen through the portal of grief, because I do believe that grief truly is a portal. And I also know personally, even though the only death I've been fortunate in this sense, the only death I've truly experienced of someone close to me is my grandmother recently. Um, I think in our society, we tend to think of grief as only the loss of a person close to us. And don't get me wrong, that's of course an absolutely heartbreaking form of grief. Um, but there's, like you said, there's so many other forms of grief, right? Grief, you probably are very aware of Francis Weller's work on the five gates of grief, but I think he explains it as like there's grief of the things that might have happened to us, right? Trauma that might have happened to us. There's grief for the things we didn't get,
Yes.
whether that is care, whether that is love, whatever, right? Freedom, like whatever your soul really needed. There's the grief of relationships ending, and there's the grief, of course, of losing someone. I think I'm forgetting a few gates, and maybe you can fill them in, but there's as a society, we are not taught how to move through grief. We're taught to numb out from the grief because we're, like you said, we're taught to rely on the prescription pills or the numbing substances like alcohol to just numb out that pain and to escape from it. But the transformation comes through allowing ourselves to feel the pain, even though it might be unbearable, and see it as like this deep transformation that it is. Because I truly believe, and this is like such a Scorpio rising thing to say, but um I truly believe that life should not be lived in like an emotionally monotone way, right? And so if you want to experience the highs of joy and peace and gratitude and love, you have to be able to experience and move through the lows of life. And grief is probably one of the lowest things that you can move through, one of the most painful experiences that we can move through, because it leaves this gaping hole in us. But as a result of that, I'm sure you can vouch for this through your experience, you're then able to also feel those, high emotional expressions. And that's, I think, the point of being human, is to feel things deeply, even though that means feeling the difficult things. So yeah, I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Absolutely. I love that. And it's interesting you talk about the highs and the lows of our emotions. The day that Greg went to Spirit, I was at my older son's house that afternoon, and my older son had a 5-week-old baby. And I was holding my little grandson, and my heart just swelled with love and joy. And I thought, how can I feel joy when my child just left this life? And in that moment, and again, this was maybe 3 hours after, I realized that joy and grief can coexist, and that we have to allow the fullness of the experience. It's so easy to want to bypass guilt, shame. Those are two prevalent emotions that you go through when you lose a child. Woulda, coulda, shoulda. What did I say that I shouldn't have said? What didn't I say? What all the things. And yet, yes, people turn to alcohol, prescription drugs. My drug of choice is work. If I don't want to deal with my feelings, I go to work. I caught myself doing it just the other night.
Mm,
And I thought, stop, just go ahead and cry and feel it and don't push it away. And that's unfortunately a byproduct of our society, which I believe has been going on for decades. I think it was probably different even 100 years ago, because life was much simpler and much slower. And yes, it was harder in some ways because all the modern conveniences of life, but it was quieter and people spent
yeah.
a lot more time in stillness. 100 years ago, we didn't have there wasn't TV. I don't even know if there was radio. There might have been radio. I don't know.
Yeah, not as easy to distract yourself.
Exactly. And that's what we have become, is a society of distractions. Oh, I don't want to look at that. I don't want to deal with that. And I had done that in my relationships before my last divorce. And that's why and again, this was all my soul, because on a conscious level, I couldn't have ever figured all this out on my own, but my soul knew what was coming and what I needed to do to prepare for that. And so I had to stop and look. Like I said, it wasn't looking at the men that I'd been married to or had relationships with. It was me, because I was the common denominator. So why had I made those choices? That takes a lot of self-reflection that people today don't want to do, because it can be painful. But I'm so grateful that I did it, because again, I didn't know what in the what was coming, 11 years later. um
Yeah.
so
Yeah, quite honestly, I mean, the way that you look at it now is for sure, like exactly like you said, all of this was preparing you for the most ultimate grief that you were going to one day experience. Yeah, like I would say that it's I briefly glanced at your chart because one of the things I've been really interested in recently, and I've been really called to look at in people's charts, is the asteroid Ceres. I don't know if you're familiar with Ceres at all.
yes.
So Ceres is, I mean, like just for the listeners who might not be aware, I do have an episode on Ceres, but Ceres is Demeter, like in Greek mythology. So she's really related to the mother archetype, but and fertility and agriculture and all these things. But for me, she's also really associated with this descent into the underworld, because in the story of Persephone and Demeter, the Demeter is the mother, Persephone is the maiden, and by Persephone being abducted from her mother, she leaves the physical world and goes into the underworld, and she obtains the crone. And so through that process, there's this triple goddess archetype that emerges, and the crone is the wisdom that we experience through looking at our shadows, through going through a death process, whether that is whatever place, whatever kind of shape and form death takes place in our lives. And so for me, Ceres is actually really associated with the energy of grief, and where we are invited to meet our own crone through experience with some kind of transformation, some kind of grief. And so I found it really interesting that your Ceres is in Capricorn, right next to your Saturn in the first house. Saturn being a very karmic planet. It is the thing that we have to work through in this life. It's like our duty, our responsibility to step into this energy. And also being associated with the mother archetype, like there's so much wisdom. Capricorn is all about wisdom. It's all about the crone energy. It's about that learned experience and the wisdom that comes from life experience. So yeah,
Absolutely.
I just wanted to kind of reflect that back to you, and also explain to the listeners, how this energy might show up in a person's life and in your soul contract in this case. And I wonder if you had ever thought about Ceres in your own chart in that way.
Definitely. And something that is really fascinating is when Greg was born, I was 29 years old and I was in my first Saturn return. And now I didn't know anything about astrology, even when Greg went back to spirit.
Mm.
Since he went to spirit and I've learned about astrology, I looked at the transits on the day he went to spirit. Saturn and Ceres were exactly where they were. Or Saturn was exactly where it was on the day I was born. I was in an exact Saturn
Wow.
conjunction. Saturn return. And Ceres was and so it was transit Saturn was conjunct my Ceres and my Saturn, my natal Ceres and Saturn.
Wow. Yeah,
Yeah.
so those are big karmic cycles coming to light, coming to completion in some sense. Wow, I just got goosebumps like and chills all up my spine, because that is Saturn lessons are really, really hard. Uh and I know that Saturn gets demonized for that reason, and called the greater malefic, but it teaches us wisdom, right? That it's the wisdom that emerges, the diamonds that emerge through really painful and deep experiences and challenges. And I think that's, it's exactly the example that you've been describing this whole time, really. So that's really interesting. Yeah. And I mean, even just while we're on the topic of Ceres, uh, my Ceres is at 29 degrees Gemini. It's in my seventh house. And I've experienced a lot of grief in my relationships, specifically with like a lot of like constantly having to almost like make new friends because friends are like moving away, and there's just so much transformation that happens through my relationships. And so that's really interesting to kind of note some of these lessons around Ceres energy in the chart. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, I would, yeah, I'd love to talk a little bit more about, um, I guess the another expression of grief, right, which we had touched on initially, and that being sort of divorce and maybe like the relationships ending and things like that, and just your general experience around that, and how that grief can be different than the grief of losing someone. But perhaps, what are the differences, what are the similarities, and how you might deal with it, right? So people moving through these two types of grief, is there kind of different approaches to it, or is it a similar approach? I'd love to learn a little bit more about that.
I think that there are a lot of similarities and a lot of differences. And the reason I say that is because obviously a divorce is not the same as losing a spouse or a child. However, it's all about expressing it. I think that's the key to all of it, is being comfortable expressing your feelings and your grief and what you need, allowing yourself to be vulnerable, allowing yourself to feel what you're feeling and not make yourself wrong for it. Um, working in in family law for, oh my gosh, 35 years now, I have helped a lot of people through the process of divorce and custody issues and all of that that goes with divorce. And even when the divorce is someone's choice, when they make the choice to leave the marriage, there's still a grieving process because it shifts your entire life. Everything that you thought you could rely on is gone. And it's like you're in this I don't know why this analogy is coming to me, but I'm going to go with it. It's like when you're being born, there's a point when you are still in your mother's uterus, and then there's the point where you're in the world, but in between, you're in the birth canal. And
Mhm.
so it's like you have to spend the time in the birth canal before you can come out the other side and be reborn. And looking at my own chart, on the days that I chose to leave marriages is also an interesting study in where planets were, how they were impacting my natal planets, and if I could utilize that in my paralegal work, I think it would help people through the
Mhm.
process a lot more. Unfortunately, that is not, acceptable. The legal world is still very, well,
Yeah.
yeah, they're not
Cruel.
open. Yeah, they don't open to that. So I do not blend the two, although I do use a lot of my psychology and coaching skills with
Mhm.
my clients. And one of the best compliments that I've received consistently throughout my career from clients is thank you for being so compassionate through this process. And something else I will share that helped me when my son went to spirit. When my mom went to spirit, I learned what it is to be vulnerable. I had chosen that as my word for the year that year because I didn't know what that word meant. And I got a real good lesson when my mom went to spirit. And so when Greg went to spirit, I allowed myself to be vulnerable, but also in those intervening years, I had learned how to ask for help, which is something that women are not good at because we don't want to be seen as weak or, you know, needy or, we think we have to be hyper independent. Yes, I can open a door for myself, but if somebody offers to do it, okay. Because I had learned how to receive help and ask for help when I need it. When my son went to spirit, I was able to ask for help. And if this had happened 10 years prior, I would have tried to do everything myself and I would have collapsed. I wouldn't have been able to do it. So I
Yes.
asked friends for help with putting together his celebration of life, picking up the food that was donated from a restaurant, bringing it, all the things that I would not have been able to physically or emotionally do. And so that's another reason why you never know what your intuitive hits are going to lead to or where you're going to need them on down the road. And, divorce is similar. That's not a decision that people make lightly.
Yeah.
And even though, yes, it is different, there's a grieving process that you have to go through. And I remember one client in particular, this was a few years ago. She already had a new boyfriend. He had been somebody she had dated decades before she got married. And she was already planning her wedding to her next husband. And yet, when she came in to sign the final divorce papers, she was teary eyed and emotional because, again, she was letting go and saying goodbye to a good part of her life.
Yeah.
And being able to honor that and then witness that and acknowledge it and not shove it aside um, is so important for us. And again, it's not acceptable in society and we don't really know how to do it. And so we shove it
Yeah.
all down and suppress our emotions, bypass, and people do the spiritual bypassing. That's something else that can be really detrimental, especially when you're in deep grief, whether it's from some kind of physical assault where there's trauma or the loss of a child, whatever it might be. Um, Doing the spiritual bypassing can really damage us if we aren't careful because it's like we're saying either A, that didn't happen, or B, it doesn't deserve to be witnessed and acknowledged um, and worked through. Uh,
Hmm. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. There's so many nuggets of information there that I want to follow up on. First of all, I do want to say I love your analogy of the birth canal because I always think of Pluto energy as because it does rule the reproductive system, and Pluto energy is that death and rebirth. And so it is that irreversible process of birth because once you're born, you can't come back into the birth canal and death. Once something dies in some sense, it can't be reborn in the same way. Relationships can transform, they can enter a new era, but they're never going to be the same, right? So yeah, that's I love that analogy. So thank you for that. The other thing that you had mentioned, so the other thing that I want to follow up on is obviously you've gone through various different types of grief. There's and you've helped so many people through their grief as well. And so, yes, I appreciate there's definitely a lot of similarities, but there's a lot of differences. And one of the key differences, as you were describing that to me, almost seems like perhaps the difference of the grief is more of a societal lens on like the different types of grief, right? When we look at the loss of a loved one, it's almost like it's more societally acceptable, right? It's more, you feel more validated probably in your grieving. Whereas, let's say you're a person who's actually, especially if you're the person who's asking for a divorce or asking for a separation, it's almost like society probably it doesn't feel very validating societally to be grieving. And so it's almost like that invalidation that we then give ourselves to even ask for help or open up and be vulnerable about these things. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, because that was just one thing that struck me as you were sharing these two different forms of grief that you've been through and that you help people with.
Absolutely. There is a difference. And I think a lot of it does have to do with society. And yet, even with the loss of a loved one, I mean, what most companies, at least here in the United States, most companies only give you like 3 days of bereavement leave when somebody dies. Well, I was fortunate enough. And again, this is something that my soul, thank God, figured out for me. I used to be an employee in a law firm. And for some reason, I always knew I didn't want to, I always called it be stuck in an office all my life. And I got to a point where I wanted to do freelance work, but it's like, how do you do that? Blah, blah, blah. And in 2013, the attorney I was working with decided he was going to leave the firm we were at and start his own firm. And he wanted me to go with him. I said, yes. And I don't want to be an employee. I want to do freelance work. And so he's like, okay, he would have agreed to anything. So I had been doing freelance work, both when my mom passed away and then when my son went to spirit. And thank God, because when I went back to work, and I went back to work pretty quickly, that Capricorn stellium in me, yeah, and Saturn responsibility, right?
I feel you
I
there.
went
Yeah.
back to
Work
work.
is my escape also.
And so I went back to work 8, 9 days after Greg went to spirit.
Wow.
In some ways, it was good for me. But what I found was, first of all, I was so grateful that I was doing freelance work because I could go to the office. And now remember, this is 2019, so this is a year before COVID. I could
Yeah.
go to the office. I could stay for 2 hours, 4 hours, however long I could physically and emotionally tolerate. And then could go home and just collapse. And so I didn't have to be there 8 hours. I don't think I could have done 8 hours a day in a law firm and been expected to produce the work that I was expected to produce. But it's interesting because and it was different after the loss of my mom versus the loss of my son. After my son went to spirit, I needed to be with people, and then I needed to be alone. And then I had too much time alone, and it was this like flip-flopping head on a swivel thing. But again, because I had followed my intuition and asked for what I needed back in 2013, which was hard for me. But because I had done that, I had set my life up so that when this did happen, I had the ideal for me situation with work. But again, society does not, even the loss of a loved one, we don't allow the grieving process. And I remember the first time I went to the grocery store after Greg went to spirit, and it literally sucks the life out of you, the breath out of you, because I remember standing there. I was in Whole Foods and I was standing there and I'm watching people go by, and I was just frozen. I was paralyzed because it's like, how can I just be out here in the grocery store doing something so mundane when I just suffered this catastrophic loss in my life? And the world's just going on around me like nothing happened. And I understood then why in, past times people wore a black, they either wore black or they wore a black band around their arm to
Yeah.
signify so that people would show them some respect.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, how do people know? And I was a hot mess in the store that day, and I'm sure people wondered what was wrong with me. I finally just left. I'm like, I can't, I gotta go home.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. No, I mean, I do really recognize that importance for like, because otherwise like before when you would wear black, people would know, and they would, and if you were, if you were acting a certain way, they wouldn't kind of put their own perceptions and judgments on why you were showing up that way. They would know, okay, this person has just gone through a major loss in their life, and they would kind of they would reserve all that for themselves or whatever. But yeah, when we don't really do that anymore, there's nothing, unless you openly talk about it with someone, there's no way for them to know what's happening in your life, and then all of their own perceptions and their own judgments and their own wounding just gets reflected on you, and they probably make up, stories about why this person's acting the way they are, right? So I think so much of it, is like the societal lens that's put on these different types of grief, and even accepting certain things as grief, and showing compassion through that. And so I mean, the few things I've heard you, mirror here around how to help yourself move through grief is like ask for help,
mhm.
learn to be vulnerable and ask for help, kind of go hand in hand. It sounds like there's a lot of room for feeling emotions, and I think I'd love to get into that. But the other one is also, I feel like you just said that and I'm escaping what the third one was. So
Well,
be
I do
vulnerable,
want to
ask for help.
I want to add something else to the conversation, and that is the difference in the way men and women are treated or
Mm,
expected to behave when they've experienced a divorce, a death, whatever it is.
yeah.
It is more acceptable for women to express their emotions.
Yeah.
And I say this at, I've represented probably just as many men as women in my paralegal career through divorce. And I see so much pain in men, and they don't feel like they can express it. And that is causing so much damage that is, I always talk about the ripple effect or the butterfly effect. Even though they may not outwardly be expressing it, when they internalize it, it affects the people around them, whether it's their children or people they work with or what have you. And because our society does not encourage men to express their emotions, they often suffer in silence. And that, I think, is something else that needs to change, because it's not healthy to keep all of our emotions in. And I think the way men and women need to express their grief is definitely different. I think men need to go, be active, and I mean, there are some women who do too. It's very nuanced and complex.
Mm,
But I think that men, whether it's going and, doing axe throwing, or, you can go and buy, I think you can, there might be places, or just go buy some cheap plates and smash them on the ground.
yeah.
Anything to release and express the emotion, because otherwise it stays internalized and then it comes out sideways. It's like the pot
Yeah.
with the lid on the top, and eventually it blows.
Yeah.
And so I think that there's a huge conversation to be had around this whole topic of emotions in general. And because
100%.
I see the hurt in men just as deeply as women. And while I do not work with men in my healing business, I've worked with enough of them through the divorce process, and they often take a really hard beating, and
Mhm.
are expected to continue to just like plow through. Although women do the same thing. I raise my hand, I've done it.
Yeah.
But it's just, and I do think and hope that it's changing,
Mhm.
but I think they have a long way to go.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely the type of area that I do a lot of work in is, emotional processing and sort of self-regulation and inner child healing and the balance between the feminine and masculine. And I can 100%, I would echo those words exactly around just the, I guess, societal kind of judgment that's placed on men who are more in their feminine or in touch with their emotions and perhaps don't seem as masculine enough. But quite honestly, I would say that the things that I see as deeply masculine are men who are actually in touch with their feminine side and can be in balance with those two polarities. And I think it's really just a mirror of the toxic masculinity in our world. Um, and it's interesting that you mentioned, almost like needing to express grief as anger with men, because anger is a secondary emotion, and usually it is covering up deep hurt, abandonment, what like some kind of emotional need that might not be met underneath it. And so it's always like more, for some reason, societally acceptable for men to show anger as like the only emotion. So if that's what we have to encourage them to do, that's fine, because then hopefully they can get underneath that anger and, you know, actually start to feel the grief and the pain and move through that. And
Exactly.
I do love that we are seeing more of these like conscious kind of communities and things like that for men that do really encourage connection to each other and like vulnerability and openness. I do think we're growing, but I think as a society we have so much healing to do. And I don't also want to even just hone in on men here, because it's women too. It's not
Absolutely.
gender exclusive. And I also want to let people know we do recognize there aren't just two genders. So I'm just largely talking about feminine and masculine balance here, right? So at the end of the day, it's about the duality that we all have inherent in us of the feminine and the masculine, and how we choose to live and express in those two energies. The feminine being more of that emotion and more of that like receptivity and that openness and vulnerability, the masculine being more about that perhaps like structure and rigidity, right? And logic. It's like the left and right brain. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's definitely an interesting thing to note when it comes to dealing with grief. Yeah, and how different people show up through that process. um yeah, so for the other thing I wanted to dive into in the last few minutes that we have here, is you had mentioned a lot about relationships as a mirror to healing yourself, and seeing yourself as the common denominator in past relationships, not kind of being able to evolve into the next step, and not saying it's always a two-person make a relationship type thing, but I think it's a really empowering way to look at a situation and say, like, I played a role in this relationship, and so what is it about this person and what they reflect back to me about myself that actually might have caused things not to go as planned. So I think that that's a really interesting thing to bring up and dive into, as it also relates to, trauma and healing trauma, whether that is childhood trauma or past life trauma. I'd love to learn a little bit more about that from you.
I really, I really discovered more about this when I started studying karmic astrology and looking at, especially the nodes and understanding, you know, the dynamics that you can learn from your birth chart. And I don't know the birth times of any of my ex-husbands, so I can't do that kind of an analysis. But just looking at it through the lens of my own chart and things like Pluto, where is that placement? And, what are the power dynamics? Because one of the things that I did, early on in my studies, I learned something called scientific hand analysis. I don't do that anymore because it's very labor intensive and hard on my eyes. And as I'm getting older, my eyes aren't as good as they used to be. But you basically look at fingerprint patterns and decode them. And you can learn what again, this is another tool to learn what someone's life purpose is and what their life lesson is. And my life lesson is around feeling powerless. And so
Mm.
I had to look, so that gave me the ability to look at where did I feel powerless in my relationships, or what the big question that I finally asked myself was, why did I choose men who I felt were not as powerful as I was. And the answer I came up with was because that way, because I don't feel powerful or I didn't feel powerful, they could not take away from me what little power I thought I had. What ended up happening was I got bored because they couldn't challenge me to grow, which I need.
Mm.
I really need in a relationship. And so, it's all a process of evolving and finding different tools that can help you keep peeling away the layers of things that you've experienced to come to some understanding of what your soul chose in this life. And that was the big lesson that I learned after Greg went to spirit, and especially when I found karmic astrology. I'll share real quickly the question I kept asking myself after he went to spirit was it my soul that wanted to have the experience of losing a child before me, and his soul, God bless him, agreed to be that child? Or was it his soul that wanted to have a shorter life, and my soul, for whatever reason, said, okay, I'll be your mom. Let's go do that.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a question that was really, it was just boiling inside of me. It was something I was so passionate about finding the answer to. I felt like that was a key for
Mm-hmm.
me in coming to a new level of understanding about what had happened. And I found the answer in karmic astrology. I had a reading with someone we know, and she
With
did
Vika, everyone. I just want to say it's with Vika, isn't
it's
it?
Vika.
Okay,
Um,
awesome.
I think she did a synastry chart between Greg and me.
Those are so
And
powerful.
his sun is in Virgo, right on conjunct my North
Mercury.
Node.
Okay, your North Node. Yeah, I was gonna say because you've got Pluto and your North Node in Virgo. Yeah, so he was your teacher.
He was. And so his
He
soul
is. He
agreed,
is.
right? So our souls agreed that for me to do what I need to do in this
Mhm.
life, he needed to go first. He needed to go ahead of me. He was truly my Saturn return baby. I mean, think about it. He was born on my first Saturn, during my first Saturn return. He left during my second Saturn return. You can't make that kind of stuff up.
No.
And then to learn to get that answer, it's like, okay. And the other thing that I kept saying early on in this journey was I must not have lost another child in another lifetime, because why would I choose this again? And I was convinced of that. And then I had a reading with a medium, or a conversation with a medium. And she said, Lori, she said, with all of the, think about 100 years ago, 500 years ago, how many women lost children? She said, I guarantee you, you have lost children in this life. So what is it that your soul wants you to learn in this lifetime? So what I came to realize is that there is something, and I believe it's to help other people, something that my soul didn't have the full experience of in past lives. And that's part of why I'm so passionate now about helping other women, because I feel like if I can finish this life doing that,
Mm-hmm.
that I've helped and fulfilled what my soul wanted to fulfill. But also then, if I don't, I feel like Greg gave his life in vain. How could I do that to my child? I can't. So
Exactly. Yeah, as incredibly painful as that experience was, it's the driver that resulted in that maturation, in that crone wisdom, right? Like that Saturn energy. And I do think I always take note of people's if they have any placements at like 29 degrees or in the first degree of signs. And I did notice that your moon sign is at 29 degrees Libra and your rising sign is 29 degrees Sagittarius, with Jupiter, Sagittarius's ruler, being exactly conjunct Venus in the 12th house. So speaking to, a lot of wisdom that is to be shared with the feminine and to help the feminine. I also think it's interesting, the moon being the mother, like the internal mother, that feminine archetype, and that being in that anoretic, like cathartic degree, the last degree of Libra. Like this is a life of a final soul lesson around um, finding some kind of peace in your archetype as a mother, I think. And with that 29-degree Sagittarius, it's like, there's some final lessons here around being a guru of some kind, like being a teacher of some kind around this wisdom that you've accumulated through your life experience that you're able to then share with other people and, help them on their journey. So I love to see people who are truly empowered by their cosmic signature and not being a victim of their life. And I think you are such a stunning example of that. And I thank you so much for your work and your wisdom and for sharing it all with everyone listening today.
Well, thank you so much. I've loved this conversation, and your insights have helped me so much through the astrocartography reading that we did, and through listening to your podcast, and just learning more through you helps me understand my soul's journey. And what you just shared is another nugget that I will definitely take with me. But there is life after trauma and loss. People say, and somebody just said it to me the other day, somebody very close to me, and it can hurt. They say, you need to move on. Well, no, you don't move on from certain traumas and losses. What you do is you move forward and you carry your loved ones with you. I carry my son with me.
Yeah.
And I don't want to be a victim, because I am not. I believe my soul chose this. So why would I choose to be a victim if I played a part in choosing this? Whether it was conscious, it definitely wasn't a conscious choice in this lifetime. But again, that's where the faith and that's my Sag rising too, is the faith and the optimism and the trust. And I know not everybody has that. So I also have the compassion for people that their struggle could be different. Their path is going to be different, but there is always hope. As long as you are still in this life, there's a reason for it. And I love to help people uncover it. So again, thank you for having me. It was such an honor, and I love our conversation.
Thank you so much. Can you let us know if there is, first of all, any last tidbit of wisdom that you want to share with the listeners, and then where they can find you, how they can connect with you? Obviously, I will put Lori's information in the show notes, as I usually do, but if there's anything you want to share with them right now, that would be a great thing to do.
Honestly, the best thing I can share is follow your intuition, even when it doesn't make sense. In 2008, I would have never guessed that I would study energy medicine. I was always fascinated and intrigued by it, but always thought that was for special people, or you had to have special gifts. And you never know when you're going to need the tools that you pick up along the way that are creating that foundation that you might one day need to land on and then to rise from.
Mm-hmm.
So
Thank you so
that
much.
would be, yeah, that would be the best thing I could encourage people to do. And then where to find me, my website, lorilatimer.com, is the best place. And there's a link on there to my podcast, but my podcast is called Grief with Grace. And that name truly came from Greg. I started a journal within days of him leaving. I didn't date it the first couple pages. I wish I had, but a month later to the day, I started writing down word combinations, and I didn't know why. And when I went to start the podcast, I looked back through that journal and I found these word combinations, and they were had the words grief and grace. And 3 months after I started the podcast, Grief with Grace, all of a sudden it hit me. Grief starts with GR, and Grace starts with GR, and Greg starts with GR. And I just looked up and I said, yeah, you gave that to me. So,
Oh, I love that so
yeah.
much. And I will definitely link the podcast in there as well for everyone to be able to tune in and listen to all of the amazing wisdom that you have to share. So thank you again, Lori. It's been a pleasure having you. And I feel like we'll have to do a part two sometime because there's just so much here.
Thank you again, Vanya.
Thanks, everyone. See you next time.